Hello, friends, and welcome back to another episode of Vital Dissent. I'm your host, as always, Patrick McFarland. This one is episode 264, and the show notes may be found at vitaldissent.com/264. And in this episode, we're going to be reviewing a Journal of Libertarian Studies article entitled The Alienation of a Homeland, How Palestine Became Israel by Stephen P. Halbrook. And, of course, the elephant in the room is shortly, before I released last week's episode about the monkey's paw, something really big started kicking off in Israel. You might have heard about it. Maybe it's the only thing that you've heard about in the last week. Of course, it's been something that's really been at the forefront of my mind in the last week, thinking about all of the innocent people who are having their lives destroyed right now, and in this conflict that we're going to get into and discuss more, but just the terrible, horrible things happening and seeing, children ripped in half on Twitter being unrecognizable because they were caught in a bombardment, and seeing other innocent people being killed. It just gets to the very heart of why I believe in anti-war and anti-war foreign policy. And indeed, I wrote an article that was released on Monday morning for the Libertarian Institute. I'm not going to be discussing that article in this episode, but I would encourage you to go on over and give it a read. It's entitled Lessons in Atrocity Propaganda, and in it I go through some of the atrocity propaganda that is being proffered by Israel to support their potential incursion into Gaza, to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians, to kick them out of the area. This is it's not contested by either side that the point is they want to go into Gaza. They want the civilians to leave. Now, whether they want to leave so they don't kill them or not, or whether they even care, I guess is left up to interpretation. But at any rate, there's nowhere for them to go, so maybe it's a moot point. But at the very least, their intention is to remove the Gazans from that land, and they say it's to defeat Hamas once and for all. And I don't know if they're going to head back, if the Palestinians can head back to Gaza after this happens, or if they're even going to leave, or if they're going to be killed by any incursion into Gaza. It's a big question mark, and of course things spiral from there. If Israel enters into Gaza, is Hezbollah going to take that? Well, the IDF is mired up in the Gaza Strip and invade from the north, and are the other Arab countries just going to sit by and watch as the IDF goes into Gaza to ostensibly destroy Hamas, but in the process ethnically cleanse the Palestinians from the land, probably never allowing them to come back and taking care of the Palestinian question, if you will. So a lot of dark stuff happening. We're going to be discussing a lot of that today. And of course, the libertarian movement hasn't really been great on this. I mean, largely certain figures have been great, but a lot of people are being revealed, I think, with their opinions on this conflict. And in a lot of ways, it's, where War and Peace seems like in some way you can read the code in the Matrix if you understand people's positions on War and Peace, because that's where they really show their hand, in my opinion. And there's been a lot of people who, in the movement, who haven't really been great on this issue, and it's a little concerning. So you'll get a lot of different opinions, about it, I guess, characterizations, but there's a lot of libertarian commenters who are really making this a culture war issue and using this as some kind of gotcha for the left, that, anyone who comes out in support of Palestine is supporting Hamas and the terrorists, no matter what they say. If they come out with platitudes that are not too different from what every American was saying after 9/11 in terms of even if you're saying glory to the resistance fighters, for instance, or you say God bless the troops, or I don't understand how that's too different. And I don't think that you would, condemn as repugnant any American who says God bless our troops, or says anything that your neighbor would have said, after 2003 or something like that. So, and all to say that there's this window of discussion that people are allowed to have when they're advocating for the Palestinians, that, anything like that, you go out and support Palestine in at this time, in this moment in time, when the United States stands on the brink of possibly intervening, or there's a potential ethnic cleansing, borderline genocidal situation about to happen, to choose this moment to go out and criticize people who are demonstrating for Palestinians because they're saying that they maybe have a right to resist their genocide, in effect. Doesn't seem like, when Daniel McAdams says, don't do the work of the CIA for them. Anyway, do you want to be on the side of the intellectual dark web, or these conservative commentators, these boner conservative commentators out there who are condemning, all these liberal college campuses are having these demonstrations that are pro-Hamas. Oh, look what the Marxists have done to our universities. Is that really, the thing that we should be saying right now? So at any rate, a lot of things about Israel-Palestine that we could focus on. Anyways, Lessons in Atrocity Propaganda is the article that I put out at the Libertarian Institute. And in it, I go through, some of the major stories that we've heard, major atrocity propaganda stories that we've heard. I've discussed World War I in depth a couple of years ago during COVID, talking about how they can twist the truth and just come up with outright lies. We talked about it, falsehood in wartime. I went through that with Keith Knight. And so I do kind of a propaganda analysis here, going through it. And I'll put a link in the show notes page to that. But I also talk about some of the interesting incentives that people have, because it seems to me that Israel and Hamas, the IDF and Hamas, have the same goal in mind, right? Like, the IDF wants a religious war, which would see them enter into Gaza and destroy Hamas once and for all. Now, like I said at the beginning, in the process, does that mean that we're going to squash the Gazans too? Because, you're going into one of the most densely populated areas of the world, and you're going to fight basically an insurgency inside of that small area where there's 2 million people that live. I would expect more civilian casualties than actual combatant casualties. And I think, isn't that the way that war usually works in the 21st or the 20th century, at least, that there's more civilian casualties than there are combatant casualties? But likewise, on the other side, Hamas seems to have the same motivation, where what they really want to do is they want to bait, because, that's what Osama bin Laden wanted to do, was commit a terrorist attack that would cause the United States to overextend itself. And in that instance, Hamas, if they can get Israel to commit to launching a full-scale invasion of Gaza, then can they rally the Arab states, the Muslim states? I know those aren't necessarily one and the same, but can they get the Muslim states to band together and come and fight the IDF inside Israel under the auspices of protecting the Gazans? I guess it remains to be seen. And if that happens, the United States is probably going to get involved. At least we've said as much. So interesting stuff there. Anyways, not to bury the lead, the Alienation of a Homeland is a Journal of Libertarian Studies article that came out in the fall of 1981. And I came across it by reading, of course, Sheldon Richman of the Libertarian Institute, his book that we released a few years back, Coming to Palestine. And he mentions, because in chapter 2, Depopulating Palestine, Dehumanizing the Palestinians, he discusses a lot of the Zionist reasons, the Zionist takes on Palestine, and some of the counter arguments here. And one really interesting thing that he says, now he does cite the Alienation of a Homeland in some of his support, and it made me want to review it here. But he also says, okay, as libertarians here, because one of the arguments that's often put forward to say that the Jews have a right to Palestine is that, well, it's often put forward by Zionists or whoever is in support of Israel. It's often put forward that the Jews, it's their native land, right? That they lived there 2,000 years ago, and that it says in the Bible or the Torah or wherever it says it. Now, I'm not fully religious and completely versed on this, but it says there that the Jews lived there in the past, that they have some kind of right by God or Yahweh to the land, so they can return there. And even if that were the argument, it's still bullshit, because if the Jews have a right to the land that they were originally there 2,000 years ago, well then, and as Stephen Halbrook argues, and we'll see, then surely someone who lived there 60 years ago has more of a right to that land after they were dispossessed of it than someone who we can't identify that lived there 2,000 years ago. Moreover, Stephen Halbrook doesn't make this argument per se, but like, what are we even doing here as libertarians? I mean, especially if you're a libertarian, and especially if you're a libertarian Zionist or supporter of Israel, you need to know that a people cannot own land, right? Unless they get together in some contracting group and take title to the land themselves. People don't own land. That doesn't exist. There's only individuals that own the land. There can't be a collective that owns the land in a real legitimate sense. Now you could get into, net taxpayers and whatever, the whole open closed borders argument, and about pragmatism and living in Ancapistan in your head, or living in the reality of the situation where states exist and they have interests. But even that argument doesn't ring true, because there was no modern state 2,000 years ago. And even 2,000 years ago, there were individuals who probably took title to land in some kind of code of Hammurabi kind of way. But currently, 60 years ago, as we'll see in this episode, there were individuals who were on that land who saw it as their own and were there and had been there for time immemorial, or for however long. So we'll get into the specifics of that. But that's something I wanted to point out first off as libertarians, in framing this whole issue as, these are the first lines from Stephen Halbrook's article, The Alienation of a Homeland. We see it right here on screen. The crux of the Arab-Israeli conflict is the Palestinian question, and the crux of the Palestinian question is, who justly owns the land of Israel or Palestine? So that really seems to be the boiled down question. Does Israel have a right to defend itself? Right? That's a question. It's taken for granted, a priori, basically, for granted that Israel has a right to defend itself, which, if that were true, then Israel would have just ownership over the land that it occupies, which is not true, because they don't have just ownership over the land that they occupy. So therefore, Israel doesn't have a right to defend itself. Now, the individuals have a right to their lives, but do they necessarily have a right to the land if that land was stolen or colonized or settled or dispossessed illegitimately? Again, they would still have a right to their lives. Individual Israelis would still have a right to their lives, but Israel itself, as we'll see, does not have a right to defend itself, because all the land it occupies, or the vast majority of it, was unjustly obtained. So continuing, I mean, that's a great segue. The parties involved in the Middle East struggle are cognizant of the centrality of the land question. Though he denies the right of all Arabs who were born in what is now Israel to return to their homeland, Polish immigrant and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin defends the right of non-indigenous Jews to settle anywhere in Eretz Israel, including the occupied West Bank, which he calls liberated Judea and Samaria. Now, my pronunciation is going to suck throughout this, and I'm sorry that this topic is like as deep as the Marianas Trench, right? And it's not something like, until the last week, I've been trying to give myself a crash course on this issue, but it's not something that I specialize in. So, but to walk you through all of this, just the thought that Menachem Begin, who, this is dated, of course, but that Menachem Begin himself is a Polish immigrant to Israel, and he denies the right of all Arabs who were born in Palestine to return to their homeland. But he, of course, being a Polish immigrant, defends the right of all non-indigenous Jews everywhere across the world to settle anywhere in Israel, including the occupied West Bank. So further on page 2, I'm going to skip around just a little bit at the beginning here. In the United States, the right of Israel to exist is taken for granted almost a priori, and the query of who justly owns the land has never really been seriously debated, at least in 1981. When the United Nations declared Zionism to be a form of racism, the U.S. threatened to, quote, take its marbles and go home. But excluded from the public forum in America was substantial dialogue over whether the UN declaration was actually well-founded. For a variety of reasons, including ethnic preference, religious prejudice, the Israel lobby, and the needs of U.S. imperialism, many Americans assume Israel's existence as a categorical imperative, which, you all should recognize this, right? Tell me if your conversations with anyone in the past week have revealed this fact. Yet, if a comprehensive Middle East settlement is ever to appear on the horizon, it will require assessment of the precise nature of Palestinian rights, and the opportunity must not slip by because of an ostrich-like refusal to face the historical facts regarding the manner in which Palestine became Israel. Now, I love this because at the beginning, he runs through all the arguments that Zionists would present to argue that they have a legitimate right to the land, and he arrives at one argument which might have merit if true, but requires historical analysis. So this is going to be really useful for you guys. If the state of Israel has a right to exist, it can only be because its citizens acquired the land in a just manner. In ideological struggle over the Middle East, standard non sequiturs are raised which obscure the ultimate issue of whether Jews, Palestinian Arabs, all of both or some of both have the right to possession of Israel or occupied Palestine. These non sequiturs take various forms. Menachem Begin's adage during his Irgun terrorist days that, quote, we fight, therefore we are, which is applied to justify subsequent Israeli conquests, assumes the ad baculum fallacy that might makes right. So he's saying you can't just say that Israel has a just right to the land because they're the stronger power that fought to get it, and therefore it's theirs. Because if that were true, certainly the same existential reasoning would demonstrate the legitimacy of the PLO's guerrilla infrastructure or Hamas's attack on Saturday, or at least parts of it, not the killing civilians part, including Yasser Arafat's Al-Fatah, George Habash's Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and other Fedayeen organizations, especially insofar as their attacks on Israel are successful. When not basing Israel's right to exist on its ability to wage victorious wars against Arabs, Begin vindicates Israeli expansion by Jehovah's gift in perpetuity of Eretz Israel to the Jewish settlers, and thereby designates seized Arab land as, quote, liberated rather than occupied. So again, this is the argument that I just confronted at the beginning of this podcast, saying, okay, just because Jehovah or Yahweh or the Lord God says that Israel belongs to the Jews doesn't mean that legally that's a legitimate right, okay? Because, you know, I don't mean to disrespect religion or anything, but anyone could write in some kind of religious book and get followers, and if they get enough followers to say, well, your house is mine, that doesn't make it legitimate. So yet international law, which views all people equally, eschews claims to territory based on theological presumptions, and it is grotesque to rationalize conquest and genocide by appeals to a higher being, which allegedly designates a privileged group as a chosen or master race. As for the Jews' right to return, in quotes, to Israel, because they populated the area 2,000 years ago, this reasoning would vindicate much more strongly the right of Palestinian Arabs to return to their homeland of only 30 years ago. Nor can Israel's right to the land be demonstrated by reference to the Balfour Declaration, for Palestine belonged to its inhabitants, not to the British foreign minister. Freedom from British colonial rule was certainly more of a right of the Palestinians in 1917 than of the British citizens of America in 1776. If we assume the right of peoples to self-determination, Arab Palestine was not for the British to give to the Zionists. Finally, justice does not presuppose that if A oppressed B, then B may oppress C. Thus, the genocidal policies against Jews by German Nazis would not justify Jewish Zionist punishment of Palestinian Arabs. Victims of the Holocaust have claims for compensation and territory against former supporters of Nazism, not against guiltless Palestinian peasants. The same principle repudiates the population exchange theory, which asserts that because Arab states expelled Jews from their Arab homelands after the Zionists expelled Arab Palestinians from their homeland, everyone has, quote, gotten even, right? Collective guilt of all Arabs cannot be based on acts by some Arab states. Zionists cannot justify their initial expulsion of Palestinians because Arab states, and not Palestinian Arabs, later carried out repressive policies against Jews. So we'll go into this last one in a little bit more detail towards the end of the piece. And if you haven't realized by now, this is going to be kind of a lengthy episode. But so some Zionists will say that after Jews arrived in Israel, there were mistreatment of Jews by other Arab states in the Middle East. So therefore, everyone is even, right? And he debunks that. He rebuts that here by saying, well, that's the fault of the other Arab states. It's not the fault of Arab Palestinians, which are different. So in short, neither military force, God, a distant past, Lord Balfour, Hitler, nor Arab state acts may, by equal standards of international law, be called upon to demonstrate the rightfulness and legality of taking the land of Palestine from Muslim and Christian Arabs and giving it to Zionists from Europe and elsewhere. If the Zionist settlers have a rightful claim to the excuse me. Jesus. Sorry, I guess this is what happens when you talk for a living. I've been talking all day. If the Zionist settlers have a rightful claim to the territory, it can only be because they acquired it from the Palestinian Arabs in a just manner. If it can be shown empirically that at the time Israel was founded, the overwhelming majority of Palestine's inhabitants were Arabs, and that most of this country's land was held by Arabs, then the Zionist claim to legitimacy must be based on their acquisition of the land through equitable and voluntary methods based on the consent of the indigenous inhabitants. But if Palestine was in essence stolen from its people, not only does Israel's existence become negotiable, but a secular democracy becomes imperative. So one of the reasons that I really got cued into this piece is because I had some kind of a Twitter post and some kind of quote-unquote Hoppian responded to me saying, oh, really? Well, this whole thing about how... I remember what it was. It was a response to the map of how Palestinian land holdings have shrunk and shrunk and shrunk over the years. I think Kyle Anzalone posted it. And some Hoppian responded to it saying, oh yeah, well, did Sheldon Richman in his book, did he acknowledge the fact that all these Israelis purchased their land from the Palestinians? And of course, I got a hair up my ass about that. And as I was reading, I said, well, I didn't respond because it's no use in responding to people. But I was going to respond and say, oh, yeah, he does. He mentions that pretty specifically in chapter 2. I think it's page 15 or 13 or 15. So, well, here's my response that everyone is going to hear. So, how Palestine became Israel. Well, the historical accuracy of her claim that the Palestinian people are of Canaanite origin may never be resolved. E.A. Finn's turn-of-the-century depiction of Palestine's traditional inhabitants provides insight into their attachment to the land. So, for people who are unfamiliar, and Sheldon Richman makes this point in his book, I think it's in chapter 1, so getting right out there, there is this claim that the Palestinians are the original Canaanites from the Bible, and I'm not going to get into that per se because Sheldon gets into it in one of his articles, and we don't even really need to get there, although it is very interesting, but we don't necessarily need to get there because his argument in this article doesn't depend on that being the case. So at any rate, the Ottomans, who ruled Palestine for 400 years until 1917, found the indigenous population to consist of the following. So this is going to the Ottoman documents. First, the Bedouin, which are the Arabs of the Arabs, who live in tents and roam the desert. So they're kind of vagabond, I don't know if they're migratory people, but they're like desert wanderers. So second, the Fellahin, plowmen or agricultural peasantry, who live in villages and are freehold owners of the soil which they cultivate. And third, the Beledin, which are townsfolk, who live and who have lived from generation to generation in cities, generally in their own freehold houses. So it'll take a little work. You might have to re-listen to this episode to really kind of get it straight. And I'll put a link to the article I'm discussing so you can read it for yourself. But so it's the Bedouin, who are the desert wanderers, the Fellahin, who are the plowmen, and the Beledin, who are the townfolk, the more urbanite folks. So, while not politically united in the sense of European nationalism, the Palestinians, particularly the peasantry, were held together by a common language, religion, custom, and hatred for Turkish rule. Quote, though they have with each other no national cohesion, the Fella clans cleave to the land with the tenacity of aboriginal inhabitants. They cling to the hills and the plains where their fathers lived and died. So I mentioned this, and this is very important because you'll hear a lot of Zionists. Laura Loomer said this, that the Palestinians don't have a nation. They're not a people. They're not a state. They've never been a state or a people. So therefore, they have no rights, and fuck them, basically, that we can just trample all over them. And that's why it's important to note this, that the Ottomans, they recognized the fact that the Palestinians were a people, even though we might not have them, we might not recognize their cohesion or their nationalist side in the way that we would a European nation. That doesn't mean that they didn't have their own kind of thing going. Now, while the peasants perceived their right to their land to be based on long-standing possession and cultivation, the Ottoman Code regarded the ultimate landowner to be the Sultan, whose agents would terminate tenure for non-payment of taxes or rent. So what you have is, for 400 years, the Ottoman Empire imposed its own legal system on the Palestinians, that they were essentially underneath the thumb of the Ottoman Empire, who ruled over them. And they had their own way of identifying their right and ownership of the land. But the Ottomans, over top of them, imposed this system, basically a feudal system. Now, Fellahin, if you remember that, is the farm working, land working peasants in villages, were severely exploited by tax farmers who, backed by troops, doubled as money lenders at rates of 60% interest. And not surprisingly, the state was regarded as an organized band of robbers. So I guess maybe libertarians would have kinship with the Palestinians because they seem to recognize what Murray Rothbard pointed out in Anatomy of the State. So the Land Registration Law of 1858, ostensibly passed to determine title to land, was actually a means of identifying properties for the purpose of taxation and of disclosing the existence of persons subject to military conscription. So he's talking about a law that the Ottomans imposed on the Palestinians and why it explains something about land ownership in the land records. So for these reasons, right, because it was a way that the Ottoman Empire would impose upon the Palestinians, for these reasons, only a small proportion of transactions were recorded, land transactions, and these chiefly concerned elderly persons, females, foreigners, and those sufficiently influential to be able to avoid military service. So because of this land law, a lot of land ownership and individual plots, like the individual owners who occupied individual plots, weren't recorded in the registries because it would subject them to more Ottoman rule, right? It was a way for them to rebel and bypass Ottoman rule. As an index of owners, the registers therefore became hopelessly incomplete. In order to avoid taxation, a person owning some hundreds of dunhams, which is like an acre, from my understanding, it's an area measurement, had them recorded as an area of, say, 10 or 20 dunhams. So, again, we see that way they bypassed the law, which would mean that when you parse it out to the end, where Zionists will argue that, well, Palestinians never had ownership, well, this is an explanation as to why most of the individual landowners would not show up in the register, essentially. So peasants who registered their land at all often did so in the names of deceased or fictitious persons, or of members of the effendi, the gentry, or of urban merchants. So title thereby existed in the names of upper-class Muslims, Christians, and Jews in Jerusalem, Beirut, and Damascus. Members of the urban elite filed whole villages in their own names, and tenure passed into the hands of those who were often landlord, tax collector, and usurer, all in one. The bribing of officials and the blackmailing of peasants also played a role in the recording of ever more land in the names of absentee landlords. The concentration of title to land was aided by the land tenure system provided in Ottoman law. So essentially what you have happening, and this is really important to what happens later, is that you have a consolidation of people holding titles. So the number of people who are holding official title to the land, not de facto like actual title, but in the legal sense, the title holders are being consolidated into a smaller and smaller group because of they're trying to avoid the land registration law of 1858. The concentration of title to land was aided by the land tenure system provided in Ottoman law, which recognized the following. One is mulk, is comparable. So these are the different ways that landowners could own land in Ottoman law, right? So in English law, we have fee simple, which means you own all of the land, you own all the rights. Because if you think of, this goes back to like basic law school. I'm trying to remember. So basically ownership in land is like, it's not just owning land, it's owning a bundle of rights. And fee simple means that you own all those rights, right? In another sense, you could have life tenancy, which means that you have basically ownership and use of a property until you die. And when you die, that title reverts back to whoever has been designated the reverter. So if I took my house and I granted a life tenancy to my mom and my mom passes away, then the title to my house will return back to me. So those are two ways that in the English law system you can own title. It's not the only two ways, but you could have land ownership in fee simple subject to condition subsequent, which means that a church could grant a piece of property to a family with the condition that if the property was ever used as a bar, then the title would revert back to the church. or vice versa. Those are English law ways to hold title. But at least in Ottoman law, he's describing one is mulk, which is comparable to fee simple in English law and exists only among a few members of the ruling elite. So complete and total ownership in the Ottoman system is only reserved for wealthy people or the ruling elite. Two, miri, I'm probably mispronouncing that, is the most common form of tenure, consisting in absolute ownership by the state and a lease to private individuals subject to payment of the land tax. So that kind of sounds like communism in a way. Although, if you think about it, if you don't pay your property taxes in the US, then your property goes back to the state. Then they sell it. So waqf, or W-A-Q-F, waqf, really consisting in miri, except that upon expiration of the founder's line, it passed to charitable purposes, and metruk, common land used for roads, grazing, etc., and miwat, or mawat, dead or wasteland claimed by the state but often used by Bedouin or Felayin. It should be noted that miri could not be mortgaged, so a bankrupt debtor was forced to transfer his rights to the usurer, who would allow the peasant to remain on the land in exchange for 2/3 of the crops. And this is it comes up later. It's important because this is what happens to many of the native Palestinians after, I think after the Israelis come in. So in the latter part of the 19th century, while title to land traditionally held by Arab peasants was being transferred to Arab and Turkish landlords, remember that's the consolidation that we were talking about earlier, another force emerged which was to have the most significant influence on the distribution of land, namely the Zionist movement, which began to support immigration of Jews to Palestine. While reliable statistics do not exist, it has been estimated that Palestine in the second half of the 19th century consisted of a population of more or less than 500,000, of which some 80% were Muslims, 10% Christians, and 5 to 7% were Jews. In 1882, Jews owned 22,500 dunams of land of the 26,323,000 dunams, which were to make up Mandate Palestine, or 0.09% of the land. So Jews owned 0.09% of the land in 1882. By 1900, there were 50,000 Jews in Palestine, mostly in Jerusalem and Jaffa, although 22 settlements existed by them then, and Jews owned 218,000 dunams, or 0.8% of the land. So that's like a tenfold increase, right? I think you're going from almost 0.1, so maybe it's an 8 times increase, from almost 0.01% to 0.8% of the land in just about 18 years. The increase in Jewish ownership was largely prompted by the founding of the Palestine Jewish Colonization Association, the PICA, by Baron Edmund de Rothschild. So that name should be familiar to some people, right? Or the founder of the Yishuv, the Jewish settlement in Palestine, who for decades was to be the largest Jewish landowner in Palestine and Transjordan. Rothschild, quote, bought land from the feudal Effendis, sometimes by bribing the Ottoman administration, and drove the Felayin off the land, end quote. Some of the same Felayin were hired to work the land that they once cultivated as their own. A different approach was taken by Zionists of a more purist opposition than the classic colonialist policy held by Rothschild. Quote, when we occupy the land, we must expropriate gently the private property on the estates assigned to us, wrote Zionism's founder, Theodor Herzl. Quote, we shall try to spirit the penniless population across the border by procuring employment for it in the transit countries, while denying it any employment in our own countries. So a little bit nicer there. But in 1907, the World Zionist Organization incorporated the Kuren Kameth l'Israel, the Jewish National Fund, which was dedicated to purchasing land exclusively for Jews and refusing employment to displaced Arabs. Beginning a year later with the building of a suburb outside Jaffa, which came to be known as Tel Aviv, Kirin Kameth was, I'm probably mispronouncing that, I'm sorry. Kirin Kameth, Kayemef, Kameth, was destined to be the major landowner in Palestine. So remember that Kirin Kameth is the Jewish National Fund, which is an entity, a Zionist entity, which would become the major landowner in Palestine. So during the last years of Turkish rule in Palestine, the land seized from Arab peasants by Arab absentee landlords were in turn being sold to Zionist settlers, whose policy increasingly was to deny employment to Arabs. So remember at the beginning, or a few 10 minutes ago, I was talking about the Hoppian who came in and was saying, oh, well, actually, the Palestinians sold the land to the Israelis. Well, we've seen to this point in the story where that doesn't exactly hold water, because for one reason or another, title in the property was consolidated into these into absentee landlords, Arab landlords, who held title because of the Ottoman laws. Over a period of time, it became consolidated in the hands of these rich Arab absentee landlords, again, who didn't even live, they weren't Palestinians, they didn't live there. But the Palestinians still were there, occupying the land that they had occupied for generation upon generation. Individuals occupying the same land that their fathers did. So only 144 Arab landlords owned a total of 3,130,000 dunhams in Palestine. In the Jezreel Valley alone, the Sursuk family of Beirut in Egypt held title to 23,000 dunhams, and, quote, the great majority of land bought by Jews in the period of Turkish rule and later under the British Mandate was acquired from proprietors of large estates. So he's saying that it was so consolidated to the point, it was so consolidated to the point that 144 Arab landlords owned 3,130,000 dunhams in Palestine. One family alone held 230,000 of those dunhams. And the great majority of land bought by the Jews in the period of Turkish rule and later under the British Mandate was acquired from those large estates. So by 1914, Jewish ownership of land amounted to 418,000 dunhams, or about 1.6% of Palestine, and Jews constituted 84,660, or 12%, out of a population of 689,000. So that's about 12%. So remember, above in 1882, it was, 0.09% Jews in Palestine. Then it was it was about 8 times more. It was 0.8. And then now in 2012, it's 1.6% of Palestine was made of Jewish occupants. Quote, His Majesty's government view with favor, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, wrote British Foreign Secretary Lord Balfour to Lord Lionel Rothschild in November 1917, adding that, quote, nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, i.e. the overwhelming majority of the population consisting of Muslim and Christian Arabs. Palestine was a land without a people, and for a people without a land, according to Zionist leader Israel Zangwill, I don't know if he's German or German pronunciation, who wrote in 1919, the power in every country always resides in the landowning classes, yet over 30,000 Arab landlords and some 600,000 Felahin are to continue in possession of the bulk of the Holy Land. To remedy this situation, measures of race redistribution will be carried out in Palestine as elsewhere. Thus, the Arabs would gradually be settled in the new and vast Arabian kingdom, Only with a Jewish majority can Israel enter upon the task of building up that model state. And I think all this speaks for itself. Welcome to the portion of the show where I tell you how you can help support this content. The best way to do that, guys, is to go to libertyweekly.club. Yes, I haven't changed the URL yet, but this is my membership website that also functions as a newsletter. So if you go to that website, libertyweekly.club, hit the subscribe button in the upper right-hand corner, and you can subscribe for the free newsletter, and I send out a lot of free content. However, there is a section in those free emails that is premium, and that premium section includes early access to my episodes, access to bonus episodes, and preprints of my articles before they're published at the Libertarian Institute or other outlets. So again, go to the website, hit subscribe in the top right-hand corner, and sign up for that email list. You go through the page here and you can see all the content that I've set out in the past. There's a whole bunch of it, guys, and you get access to those previous emails that have gone out as well. Another way to help support me is to go to vitaldissent.com/stitchfix and sign up through my link there. You'll get $25 off your first order, and I will also get a $25 credit. Guys, I use this to buy my wardrobe. I'm a father of two. I have my own business. I do this, and I don't have time to go shopping. Can't haul the wife and kids around to have a leisurely shop for myself to pick these clothes. So what Stitch Fix does is that they pick the clothes for you. They send them to you in fixes, and it's really awesome stuff. These are all the pieces that I personally have bought myself. There's a lot of work stuff in there, but there's also casual stuff. I got an awesome plaid shirt that's in there, a flannel, really love that. I got this really cool sweatshirt. I got these awesome boots and a nice windbreaker, really good stuff. So go on over to vitaldissent.com/stitchfix. You can also get Vital Dissent, really hard not to say Liberty Weekly, Vital Dissent merchandise with the cool, awesome new logo from Mises Pieces. You can get all these kinds of things, all this merch. You got coffee cups, pint glasses, sweatshirts, premium t-shirts, premium sweatshirts, all that good stuff there at vitaldissent.com/merch. Also, guys, I started a TikTok channel, and I think that'll be really cool, trying to get more eyeballs on this content and more views. You can see it's already garnering a bunch of views, where I do anti-war cartoon reviews and a lot of cool stuff there. So vitaldissent.com/TikTok is where you can find me. My handle is at @PatMcFarland_, the same as my Twitter handle. Okay, guys, that's about it. Check out those things. Please help support this content. Help me pay my producer and make the show better for you guys. Thanks. So before October 1920, Jews held 650,000 dunhams, and land sales quickly increased under the British mandate. The first significant Quran Kameth purchase of 7 Arab villages was a factor in the 1921 Arab uprising, which led Britain to enact the Transfer of Land Ordinance in 1921, whereby the landlord was required to see that tenants uprooted by sales retained land elsewhere. However, landlords evaded this ordinance simply by evicting tenants before the sale. So there you go. We got a way around that. Comparable acts to protect cultivators passed in the following 2 decades were also evaded, increasing the number of landless Arabs. In any case, the first real census of Palestine, taken in 1922, indicated that Jews numbered 83,794 out of a total population of 757,182. Thus, Jews, about 3/4 of whom lived in the Jerusalem Jaffa area, and about 2/3 of whom were European immigrants, constituted 11% of the population. Estimates respecting just wanted to check that. Estimates respecting distribution of land indicate that in the same year, excluding freehold fellaheen, 3 million dunhams of the land of Palestine were held by only 120 Arab families. By 1927, Jewish landholdings more than doubled from the start of the war to 865,000 dunhams, still only 3.3% of Palestine. So I wanted to mention too that although there is, under libertarian property rights ethics. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty details of it, but the Lockean homesteading idea has, it equates ownership with use and occupancy of the land, in terms of, marking off borders and working it and being involved with it. And so in that respect is the right that Palestinians have and claim of this occupancy and working the land. I'm not sure in in a traditional, and maybe this is room for some pushback, there might be some space here from a libertarian perspective to argue that title ownership over the land, such as these landlords, these absentee landlords having title, holding title to the land, that it should be legitimate that it was sold to, for just compensation to the Israelis. There might be some room for argument there, but then I think you would have to go back, and my response to that would be to go back and look at the reason why title was being passed to these Arab families, and I would argue that it wasn't a legitimate purchase for consideration, that these Arab families, they weren't bona fide purchasers of this property that they were getting title ownership to. The title ownership was being consolidated in that way through a coercive, imposed legal system that is not legitimate. They're not legitimate purchasers. So there's my response to that. So a year after the 1929 revolt, in which Fellahin and especially Bedouin played a major role, the Simpson report estimated that about 30% of Arab villagers were landless. Unlike the Jews, who had favorable long-term leases, Arab tenants held land on a yearly basis, terminable at the landlord's will. The economic condition of the fellah was desperate, for scarce capital, heavy debts, rising rent, overtaxation, and high interests were crushing this class. One study showed the average fellah family in possession of about 75 dunhams, while double that amount would have been required for a decent standard of living. Peasants borrowed at 30% interest or more, or sold their land in order to pay the tithe, which might be a fourth of a fellah's income, and other taxes, debts, and subsistence expenses. Cultivators without land were required to give the landlord whose land they worked about half the produce. The Fellahin were literally bankrupt. 64% of the families in one subdistrict had execution proceedings pending against them. A family's whole crop could be attached for taxes, and imprisonment for debt was extensive. The condition of the fellah was hardly better than under the Turks. So he's talking here about British rule. Well, the Jewish Agency pressed its claim to all lands owned by the government. Considerable areas over which the government had de jure claims had been occupied and cultivated by Arabs for very many years. Not only were areas available for Jewish settlement negligible, but already Jewish settlements were interfering with the rights of grazing and cultivation of Bedouin, the majority of whom wandered in Beersheba as in ancient times. Fellahin, who were evicted from their lands in the countryside on immigrating to the cities, found that the Histadrut, the Jewish Labor Federation, excluded them from employment in Jewish industry and commerce, resulting in serious unemployment. Zionist policies faced Arabs with discrimination based on race, religion, or national origin at every turn. Kibush Hakarka, conquest of the land, took the Arab tenants' land. Kibush Havoda, conquest of labor, prevented the hiring of Arabs as employees, and Totzeret Haaretz, produce of the land, imposed a boycott of Arab-produced commodities. The Constitution of the Jewish Agency in 1929, Article 3 declared, quote, land is to be acquired as Jewish property and held as the inalienable property of the Jewish people. The agency shall promote agricultural colonization based on Jewish labor and in all works or undertakings carried out or furthered by the agency. It shall be deemed to be a matter of principle that Jewish labor shall be employed. So, I mean, to me, it sounds like two different, it sounds like apartheid. So the Kieran-Kameth lease contained the restrictive covenant based on race that the holding shall never be held by any but a Jew, and that only Jewish labor could be employed in connection with cultivation of the holding. Jewish lessees who hired or attempted to sell rights to Arabs were to have their own leases terminated. So, now again, I don't know the Constitution of the Jewish Agency in 1929. I don't know if that's an official governing document or if that's some kind of private arrangement, which would be different as to whether this is like apartheid or not, or second class, creating a second class citizen under law. However, it's saying here that if you were a Jew, an Israeli Jew, and you leased land from the Kieran-Kameth, or the Kameth, which is I forget the official name, but it's the largest Zionist landholder, then your lease would be terminated if you subcontracted to an Arab. If you hired or attempted to sell rights to Arabs, your lease of the land would be terminated. So the census of 1931 revealed an Arab population, including Muslims, Christian, Drusses, etc., of 861,200 and a Jewish population of 174,600, or 17%. So we have, continuing increase of Jewish population percentage. The same estimate of 66,553 Bedouin as suggested in 1922 was used as if no population increase ever occurred among this sector of the Arab population. While the doubling of the Jewish population, which was about half European since the previous census, was due primarily to immigration, the increase in the Arab population resulted from natural causes. With further Jewish immigration and land purchases in the 30s, foreclosures by absentee holders of legal title who often resided in Damascus, Beirut, Cairo, and Kuwait dispossessed an ever-increasing number of Feliyin. The sale by the Lebanese Sursouk tax farmer family of 240,000 dunhams alone displaced almost 9,000 people. So here is Table 1, land acquisitions of the PICA, Kieran-Kameth, and Palestine Land Development Company as of 1936. So 52% was acquired from large absentee landowners. 24.6% was acquired from large resident landowners. And 13.4% was acquired from government, churches, and foreign companies. And only 9.4% was purchased from Feliyin, the actual farmers who occupied the land that they lived on and worked on. And I assume that's because only 9.4% of those Feliyin that sold their land actually owned the title or had retained the title to their land from, the days of absentee landowners, when things were consolidated under absentee landowners. So by the end of 1936, the PICA, Kieran-Kameth, and Palestine Land Development Company, all Zionist organizations, held title to land as indicated in Table 1. As the former director of Kieran-Kameth commented, quote, "If we add up all these figures, we shall find that no less than 90.6% of all acquisitions were of land which formerly belonged to large landowners, while from Feliyin only 9.4% was purchased. While it is not known how many Arab tenants were thereby evicted, in 1936 Jewish land ownership amounted to 1,231,000 dunhams." So interesting to note in the table, I didn't mention that it seems like the director of Kieran-Kameth himself commented that the land that was acquired formerly belonged to large landowners, it was acquired, so it doesn't mean that it was purchased, that it was a bona fide purchase per se, but it seems like the 9.4% of land that was purchased from the Feliyin was purchased like a bona fide purchase. So while it is not known how many Arab tenants were thereby evicted, I read that. So it is not surprising that when Arab workers and peasants, sparked by Al-Qassam's guerrilla offensive in the countryside, rose up in armed struggle and engaged in general strikes during 1936 to 1939, the feudal elements led by al-Husseini favored a compromise with the British, who, aided by the Zionists, crushed the revolt. Interesting too, I forgot to mention this, so that of the 9.4% of Feliyin who sold their land, we don't know how many of them sold their land because they were coerced into selling it, either by Israelis or coerced into selling it by colonial British policy that basically forced them into a corner of indebtedness that forced them to sell their land because of discriminatory policies. So, quote, "There is no room for both peoples together in this country," reflected Joseph Weitz in 1940. Head of the Jewish Agency's colonization department and in charge of land acquisitions, Weitz continued that, quote, "There is no other way but to transfer the Arabs from here to the neighboring countries, to transfer all of them. Not one village, not one tribe should be left." So when you hear things in the news of people saying, especially like these boner conservatives saying, "Oh, well, why doesn't Egypt take them in? Or why doesn't Jordan take them in? Or why doesn't Syria take them in? Or why doesn't Lebanon take them in?" First off, a lot of those states are Arabs and they don't want to see the Palestinians dispossessed of their land because, I mean, take it to the bank that if the Palestinians leave Gaza, they're not going to get it back. They're not going to have the right of return. So that's one reason. But on the other hand, know that when a conservative or a Zionist or someone says that, they are embracing this discriminatory policy of, you've heard quotes from these Zionists. The people who are responsible for a lot of this, responsible for the long campaign, the long march to have the Jews be completely in possession of Israel and to dispossess the Palestinians, that this is a long-held, long sought-out policy that was created, in effect, that was created and pushed by people with the clear intention of basic ethnic cleansing, transferring these people from their land and displacing them somewhere else. Where would they go? We don't care as long as it's not in Israel. So a survey of Palestine prepared for the Anglo-American, here, I don't know if I finished this, transfer from here to the neighboring countries, to transfer all of them. Not one village, not one tribe should be left. So a survey of Palestine prepared for the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry in the mid-40s described the continuing dispossession of the Feliyin in the same manner as had the Simpson Report. Legal fictions regarding title rather than traditional rights based on possession continued to ensure land transactions between large Arab and Zionist landowners. So legal fictions is, again, something created, a legal fiction, something that was conjured up. Some kind of right was found. So like in Crusader Kings, right? I don't know if you guys have played that, but it's like a, civilization type game. And in order to declare war on a neighbor, you have to find a casus belli. Well, one thing you do in the game is you have your like Secretary of State go to the country you want to invade and have him do legal research to come up with a casus belli. And one of the casus belli might be that he'll invent that you have a claim to that territory by going through the lineage records and finding some distant claim that you might have to that land that he probably counterfeits. And so that you have a casus belli to invade the neighboring land. That's a part of the game, and it's something that would happen all the time in the Middle Ages. So that's what he means by legal fiction, is like, oh, you find this claim that you can press to the land. The Ottoman land registry records still constitute the basis of a large number of claims to legal rights in Palestine. That's a quote. Yet Arab agriculturists worked state lands, in quotes, to the extent that, quote, it cannot be assumed that government is in possession of extensive tracts of land which are lying idle. In 1944, the Jewish population determined to be 553,600 out of 1,739,624, including the never-increasing nomads, of course, held 1,731,300 dunams. This total area of Jewish land represents 6.6% of the total area of Palestine. So a smaller official estimate for Jewish land holdings at the end of 1944 set the figure at 1,491,700 dunams as compared to 12 million, I'll just say 12.766 million dunams owned by Arabs and 1.5 million dunams of public land. This excludes the 10.5 million dunams composing Beersheba, which Bedouin freely inhabited, traditionally basing their rights on use and not on title conferred by what they perceived as outside forces. The Bedouin always had their land underestimated because their method of crop rotation involved leaving land fallow for a couple of years. Assessors included only land in current use. In any case, 85% of cultivatable lands were held by Arabs, 13% by Jews, and 3% by the public. The proportion of Jewish to non-Jewish land ownership is presented in map 1. Okay, so from 1922 until 1945, an estimated 96% of the Muslim population growth was due to natural increase, while 72% of Jewish population growth was attributed to migratory increase. So you have so much of the increase in population due to Jews coming from all over the world to settle there. While 2/3 of the Jews lived in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Haifa, and Jaffa, 70% of Muslims resided in villages, although the latter percentage still indicated a trend toward urbanization. The last official mandate government population estimates found 589,000 Jews out of 1.9 million persons at the end of March 1947. So that's about 31% in 1947 were Jews. Now, by the end of that year, Jews owned 1.7 million dunams, or 6.6% of Palestine, having bought 57% of this land from large Arab landowners, 16% from government, churches, and foreign companies, and 27% from Fellaheen. Graph 1 and Table 2 summarize the growth of Jewish population and land ownership, respectively. The United Nations Partition Resolution of November 1947 provided for a Jewish state of about 57% of Palestine, although Jewish land ownership was only about 10% of the proposed state. The gerrymandering plan included 500,000 Jews and 500,000 Arabs within the state. Yet for the Zionist leadership, this was too little land and too many Arabs. It was not only the Irgun of Menachem Begin and Moshe Dayan, whose organization exploded bombs in Arab population centers, that desired the new state to consist of the whole of Mandate Palestine or more, and to be Arab in reign. I don't know how to pronounce that. Arab in reign. An expansionist who foresaw an Israel extending from the Nile to the Euphrates, David Ben-Gurion, never intended to abide by the UN boundaries, and in his state, quote, there was no place for Arabs. Ben-Gurion wanted to attack Arab population centers. So we're going to get into that. Just wanted to review these graphs here. So, excuse me, when the UN partitioned, at the time that the UN partitioned Israel or Palestine, 57% of Palestine was given to the Jews, although the land ownership was only about 10% of that proposed state. So it seems like a huge increase in the amount of land available for Israelis, for Jews. And here's the Palestine land ownership by sub-districts in 1944. So you can see there. And population statistics of Mandate Palestine, we already kind of went through. So again, Ben-Gurion, he remained skeptical about any possibility of coexistence with the Arabs. The fewer there were living within the frontiers of the new Jewish state, the better he would like it. He did not actually say this, but his position was clear. A major offensive against the Arabs would not only break up their attacks, but would also greatly reduce the percentage of Arabs in the population of the new state. While this might be called radical racialism, the whole Zionist movement actually was based on the principle of a purely Jewish community in Palestine. On October 9th, 1948, 254 unarmed men, women, and children at Deir Yassin, an Arab village west of Jerusalem, were massacred by Zionist terrorists. Most of the mutilated bodies were thrown down a well, while others were scattered about the village. Well, the attack was spearheaded by Begin's Irgun Zvai Leumi and the frankly fascist Stern Gang. The commander of the Haganah approved the attack, although Ben-Gurion's party attempted to exculpate itself from blame. According to Begin, the attackers used, quote, large numbers of hand grenades, and the civilians, quote, suffered inevitable casualties. Deir Yassin was, quote, the first Arab village to be captured by Jewish forces, leading the Arabs to expect genocide at the hands of the Zionists. Panic overwhelmed the Arabs at Eretz Israel. Arabs throughout the country, induced to believe wild tales of Irgun butchery, were seized with limitless panic and started to flee for their lives. This mass flight soon developed into a maddened, uncontrollable stampede. In Jerusalem, Zionist soldiers paraded a few bloodstained Deir Yassin survivors through the streets, and in Haifa, Zionist loudspeakers warned the Arabs of more Deir Yassins. Quote, all the Jewish forces proceeded to advance through Haifa like a knife through butter. The Arabs began fleeing in panic, shouting, Deir Yassin. 60,000 Arabs fled Haifa, and almost all of Jaffa's Arab population of 100,000 evaporated. Almost 900 villages and 5 million dunams of land were abandoned, as some 750,000 Arabs fled, Jewish, Arab, and British armies alike. The greater part of the agricultural land was in the hands of these villagers. So in mid-May of 1948, and this is what is referred to as the Nakba, the disaster, when Israel proclaimed its existence as a state, Jews were still less than 1/3 of the population of Palestine. Jewish land ownership, as a result of the expulsion of the Arabs, jumped from nearly 7% of Palestine to 79% of Palestine. Thus, it was military force rather than a half-century of land purchases, largely from Arab absentee landowners, that was the primary method by which the land of Palestine became the land of Israel. So, yeah. So a lot of people, I've been looking on Wikipedia and kind of trying to get the Zionist view of the Nakba, this event. And some counter arguments that you might get would be, well, the Palestinians voluntarily left, or they left at the urging of the Arab states who, wanted room to fight the war that ensued after it. And even if that's the case, they were made to leave the land. They didn't leave voluntarily, whether they left because they feared that they would be massacred by Israel, or if they left because they were enticed or commanded to leave by the other Arab states. That's not a legitimate, they should have a right of return if they're going to keep titled to the land, or if they're going to keep ownership of the land. Just because they left coercively doesn't mean that it's rightfully Israel's land now, or the open for Jews. At any rate, and we just have a little bit left here. Few pages. The ensuing years, I'll kind of breeze through this. While many Arabs fled with the intention of returning to their homes when the violence ended, most were not permitted to return to their villages, and a combination of military and legal devices were employed in the ensuing years to destroy or expropriate Arab homes and lands. In the 10-year period from the end of the war, about 1 million dunams of Arab land were expropriated. Even in cases such as Birim and Ikrit, in which the Israeli Supreme Court ruled in favor of dispossessed Arabs, military occupation authorities prevented the enforcement of the decrees by dynamiting the whole villages, driving peasants and Bedouin across the borders, and shooting those who attempted to return as, quote, infiltrators. The law on the acquisition of absentees' property in 1950 transferred to a custodian all real and personal property of, quote, absentees, i.e., persons who left their places of abode in a specified period and fled temporarily to a place not under Israeli occupation. The custodian transferred the land of the absentees, who in many cases had returned to their homes and worked the land at the time of expropriation, to Jewish settlers, over a third of whom ended up by 1954 living on, quote, absentee property. A number of other laws in the 50s relating to military occupation resulted in the expropriation of more and more property from Arabs for, quote, security reasons. Most, quote, abandoned property came into the hands of Karen Kameth, which possessed less than 1 million dunams on the day Israel proclaimed itself a state, but which within half a decade acquired almost 2.5 million more dunams, becoming next to the state the largest landowner in Israel. Restrictive covenants disallowing non-Jews from enjoying any rights under leases were continued in force and extended to state lands, denying Arabs any potential benefit from 90% of the land of Israel. At the same time that Palestinian Arabs were being denied repatriation, the law of return in 1950 allowed, quote, Jews to immigrate freely to Israel, thereby increasing the number of Zionist settlements and reducing the percentage of Arabs within Israel's borders. Unsatisfied with previous acquisitions, Begin declared before the Knesset on October 12, 1955, quote, I deeply believe in launching a preventative war against the Arab states without further hesitation. By doing so, we will achieve two targets. Firstly, the annihilation of the Arab power, and secondly, the expansion of our territory. A year later, some 50 Arabs were massacred in Kafir Qasim, located in Samaria, and not long thereafter, the Suez Adventure provided an unsuccessful opportunity for Begin's plans. It remained for the 1967 war for Israel to occupy the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, to which Begin, as early as 1948, claimed the Jews had a right, as well as the Golan Heights and the Sinai. The successive governments of Levi Eshkol, Golda, there are no Palestinians, Mir, and Yitzhak Rabin promoted settlements in these occupied territories. As a result of the June War, 1.7 million Palestinians, largely non-citizens, were under Israeli occupation, and another 1 million Palestinians remained outside Palestine, mostly on the East Bank. So we see here Israeli expansion from 1947 to 1967. Excuse me. This one here, UN Partition Plan of 1947, and then the 1948 war, and after the 1967 war. You can see all of that is the Jewish state now. Well, at least after the 1967 war. By early 1973, it was estimated that out of 475 substantial Arab villages before 1948, only 90 remained. Settlements throughout the occupied territories have escalated at an ever-increasing rate since the Yom Kippur War of 1973 and the election of Begin during 1976. Confiscation and expropriation of Palestinian Arab land, creation of illegal settlements, which are afterwards legalized, and the consequent spontaneous demonstrations, as well as guerrilla actions by Palestinians, countered by repression by the Israeli armed forces, mark the present epoch. Map 2 exhibits 3 decades of Israeli expansion. If Zionist colonization resulted in the direct dispossession of the lands of the Palestinian Arabs and the expulsion of 750,000 from their homeland. An indirect result was the expulsion of a like number of Jews from the Arab world. Now, remember at the very beginning, we talked about this quickly. Although since ancient times, Muslims and Jews have engaged in oppression and massacres both among and between themselves, the Arab world has been a refuge for Jews from Europe since the Spanish Inquisition, and it received refugees from Hitler long after the United States and Great Britain disallowed Jewish immigration. But, particularly in 1948, an upsurge in anti-Jewish riots and government action resulted in numerous deaths, increasingly widespread confiscation of Jewish property, and the immigration of many Arab Jews from their ancient homelands. Of the Arabs who fled Palestine and the Jews who fled the Muslim countries, one commentator stated, quote, "All of the above peoples fled or were driven from their homes, and few of them were allowed to take with them either money or possessions, or to retain any property rights, however ancient." Table 3 indicates the Jewish population in the Arab world in 1948 and 1977. Of the Jews who immigrated, about 500,000 settled in Israel, while the remainder went to America and Europe. Although the Arab states bear most of the blame for the oppression or expulsion of the Jews in their midst, a number were driven out not as Jews but as Europeans. In Egypt, for decades, many riots have been anti-foreigner as such. For example, the 1956 crisis, in which all British and French citizens were expelled, including many Jews who were European citizens. Egyptian citizens were not expelled, although some who were Jewish were interned as alleged collaborators. Additionally, of the Jews who left Algeria in the 1960s, 125,000 went to France and only 14,000 to Israel, indicating that they departed as French colonists, consequent on the Algerian Revolution. While few Jews were in Lebanon in 1948, within a decade, 9,000 found refuge in that liberal Arab country, although the recent civil war has driven away people of all ethnic backgrounds. Although the Iraqis carried out oppressive policies against Jews, not to mention larger minorities such as the Kurds, it is known that Zionists exasperated this process by bombing synagogues and other Jewish centers in Baghdad in 1951, resulting in numerous casualties. Such actions add sustenance to the claim that Zionists have always attempted to strain relations between Arab Jews and their homelands. Finally, Syria, Morocco, Egypt, and other Arab nations now have removed legal restrictions on Jews and have invited those who immigrated to return and realize full rights of citizenship. While these affirmations of non-discrimination against Jews do not compensate for the shameful destruction of Jewish life and property carried out by Arab states, Israel has not given even token support to the suggestion that Palestinian Arabs may return to their own homeland. So the last paragraph here of this piece. Arab states which cause damage to the persons and properties of Jews have an obligation to return property seized or to compensate its owners, as well as to compensate families of those murdered by official state action. Similarly, Palestinian Arabs have the rights to return to their homes and estates taken over by Israelis, to receive just compensation for loss of life and property, and to exercise national self-determination. Palestinians may have moral claims not only against Zionists, who took their lands by force, but also against members of the Arab elite, who made huge profits in land sales to Zionists by evicting tenants who had cultivated the land since time immemorial. No balance is achieved in the status quo. The Zionist expulsion and dispossession of Palestinians is not, quote, made up for by like treatment by Arab states towards its Jewish citizens. Palestinian Arabs simply have not benefited from the oppressive acts carried out by Muslim states against Jews. Compensation, return of property, and repatriation are rights held by Arab Jews and Palestinian Arabs alike. Whew. All right. Well, thanks for bearing with me through that piece. It is lengthy, but it's very detailed, and I think I have my copy here. It is very detailed, and I think that, as we said at the beginning, this whole debate, the whole question is wrapped up in who justly owns the land, Israel or Palestine. And I think that this piece is a quintessential, first, it provides history that is lacking and never discussed. And second of all, it's written by Stephen P. Halbrook, which is, I mean, he's a famous conservative. I don't know if he's famous, but he's a conservative Second Amendment attorney who went to George Mason University and is a member of the Virginia State Bar, if I'm reading that correctly. So published in the Journal of Libertarian Studies. Focus, right there. So I'll put a link to this in the show notes page. And of course, I'm not saying, I mean, just because the correct answer right now is the Jews don't have any legitimate right aside from, direct bona fide purchases from Palestinians of property that they could directly show was voluntarily sold. They don't have a right. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like this is a solution to the situation right now. I think this is the correct answer and what should happen. Of course, what he highlighted in the last paragraph, but that doesn't mean it's realistic. And I think, but all of these rabbit hole arguments go back, and you can knock down these presuppositions that Zionists and these boner conservative, like Israel sellouts say that, oh, Israel has a right to defend itself and the Palestinians aren't a people, and, a state or entities, amorphous entities, can have a right to the land, or we can claim a right to the land because we're stronger, or by conquest, or because 2,000 years ago, Moses came down from the Temple Mount or from Mount Sinai with stone tablets, and whatever like that. I would go Scott Horton. Scott has had some good interviews lately that kind of goes over, and I think it's with Martyr Made. He just did an interview with him, and one with Max Blumenthal talking about the more modern history. And I think Scott has a good take on, what is the current situation and what is a bit more realistic of a peaceful settlement for this, because that ultimately is what I would advocate for, is, at least at this point in time where I don't know what will be happening when this comes out, because the Arab states, right, or have made an announcement, or they were supposed to say something tonight about Hezbollah and maybe Iran jumping into the fray and joining the fight if Israel doesn't cease bombing. And who knows what's going to happen. But I sincerely hope that doesn't happen, although I don't want to see a situation take place where Israel enters the Gaza Strip, and of course there's still a couple million people there because they don't have anywhere to go. All the border crossings are closed, and now there's going to be a prolonged, counterinsurgency, brutal Stalingrad type battle between, or either it's going to be, ethnic cleansing, a street to street horrible guerrilla war against Hamas, or it's going to be Israel entering and Hezbollah coming down from the north, and then I don't know, maybe Syria and maybe Iran gets involved, and I don't know if all these other Arab states, I'm not an expert on the area, and who may or may not jump in at that point, but it's very concerning because the United States would, or else our entire world order, our entire rules-based, quote-unquote, rules-based world order will crumble apart, because if the United States doesn't come to the aid of Israel when it's legitimately facing like an existential threat that could end its existence, and because of its own doing, of course, but when it's legitimately facing a situation that could mean the end of its state itself, because they've chosen to enter Gaza, and now all the Arab nations are coming down upon them in one gigantic, righteous jihad. If the U.S. doesn't come to Israel's aid, what are all the NATO states going to think about that? And what is Taiwan going to think about that? And I mean, it's not really of much concern to me, but if you're an American empire, rules-based world order, unipolar moment type neoconservative, I can't imagine a worse thing as someone calling your bluff and you not doing anything. But at that point, I don't know, Ben Shapiro is saying that Israel should use nuclear weapons to defend itself. And there's other people who have alluded to that as well. The nuclear weapons that everyone knows Israel has, except, no one says it, that they have these nuclear weapons. So anyways, thanks for sticking in there for an hour and a half long episode of Vital Dissent. Again, I'll put show notes in the show notes page, and I'm sure, there will be a portion of the listenership who's incensed by this episode, who are Zionists for one reason or another. And I suppose if you're upset about this, send me an email or drop a comment or something like that, and I will tell you why you're wrong. So we got that settled. All right, all kidding aside, I welcome feedback or any comments, and any listeners. I guess we can have a good faith disagreement on this issue, but I think you're wrong, but we can talk about it. So vitaldissent.com, libertyweekly.club is my membership website, where you can get early access to my articles and to previews of part 2 and part 3 coming of the Jesus Christ. Sorry, it's late and I'm tired. Should wrap this up. That documentary I did, whatever the fuck it's called, on the plutonium injection experiments, and The Truth About Oppenheimer, part 1 and 2 and 3, you get early access to that. I also do bonus episodes, and there's a bunch of free content too. So if you want to sign up for my email list, I try and send out emails as often as my busy schedule will allow, and do all that bonus stuff for you. But if you want to support this content, you like what I do, subscribe, rate, review, do all those things, or head over to libertyweekly.club. That's the URL. Click the subscribe button in the lower right-hand corner and select a plan. It's monthly, $5 a month, or you get $5 off for a year-long subscription at $55 per year. All right, so that's everything from me. We will catch you next time. Peace.